In the heart of New York City, where the cacophony of sounds never ceased, there was a killer who lived in complete silence. The city had never seen anything like it, victims targeted for their voices, their vocal cords surgically removed as gruesome trophies. The media dubbed him the Silent Surgeon, but no one knew his true identity or the haunting silence that enveloped his world. Detective Sarah Lawson stood at the edge of the latest crime scene, a high-end recording studio. The victim, famous radio host Mark Harris, lay lifeless on the soundproof floor, his throat meticulously cut. Sarah knew this case would be different. Each murder left no traces of struggle, no screams for help, just silence. Another one, her partner, Detective Jake Mitchell, muttered as he joined her. "That makes 5 in the past 2 months." Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the room. "He's choosing them for their voices. Singers, radio hosts, actors, anyone with a distinctive voice?" Jake looked around, his frustration palpable. "But why?" "What's the connection?" Sarah sighed. "That's what we need to find out. Let's start by talking to his colleagues. Maybe they heard or saw something unusual." The investigation begins. They interviewed everyone at the studio, but no one had noticed anything out of the ordinary. Mark had been alone when he recorded his last show. The security footage showed a shadowy figure entering the studio but never leaving. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air. Days turned into weeks, and the city grew more anxious with each passing day. Sarah and Jake worked tirelessly, poring over evidence, chasing leads, and trying to understand the mind of the silent surgeon. They discovered that all the victims had one thing in common. They had recently received fan mail from someone named Simon. "Who's Simon?" Jake asked, staring at the letters spread out on the table. Sarah shrugged. "No idea, but look at the handwriting. It's almost identical in every letter, and they're all typewritten, no return address." Jake frowned. "Could be a pseudonym, someone who's fixated on these voices. Maybe he felt a connection to them." Sarah's eyes widened as a thought struck her. What if Simon is deaf? What if he can't hear their voices but reads their lips or feels their vibrations? That would explain the obsession with vocal cords. A new lead with a new sense of urgency, Sarah and Jake visited the New York School for the Deaf. They spoke with the director, Dr. Emily Foster, who was more than willing to help. "We've had a few students who were exceptionally talented in lip reading and feeling vibrations," Dr. Foster explained. "But I can't imagine any of them committing such horrendous acts." Sarah showed her the fan letters signed by Simon. "Do you recognize the handwriting?" Dr. Foster examined the letters carefully, her expression thoughtful. "It's difficult to say for certain, but there is one former student who comes to mind, Simon Jacobs. He was obsessed with voices, always talked about feeling their vibrations, reading their lips, but he left the school years ago. We haven't heard from him since." Jake leaned forward. "Do you know where we can find him?" Dr. Foster nodded. "I believe he lived in a small apartment in Queens. Here, I'll give you the address." Closing in armed with the address, Sarah and Jake headed to Queens. Simon Jacobs' apartment was a modest, run-down building that seemed out of place in the bustling city. They knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Jake picked the lock and they entered cautiously. The apartment was dark and cluttered with papers, books on anatomy, and old medical instruments. Sarah's heart raced as she realized they were in the lair of the silent surgeon. In the corner, they found a small shrine dedicated to voices, photos of the victims, their vocal cords preserved in jars, and a collection of recordings. "This is sick," Jake muttered, his face pale. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "We need to find him before he strikes again." Suddenly, they heard a faint noise coming from the bedroom. They drew their guns and approached the door. Inside, they found Simon Jacobs sitting at a desk, surrounded by more jars and photos. He looked up, his eyes cold and empty. Simon Jacobs. "You're under arrest," Sarah said, her voice steady. Simon didn't move. He simply stared at them. his expression unreadable. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. This was a man who lived in a world of silence, driven by an obsession they could never fully understand. The final confrontation. Back at the station, Simon refused to speak or cooperate. Sarah and Jake knew they had to find a way to break through to him. They decided to bring in Dr. Foster, hoping she could communicate with Simon in a way they couldn't. Dr. Foster sat across from Simon, signing to him in American Sign Language. At first, he ignored her, but gradually, he began to respond. He says he chose his victims because their voices were beautiful, Dr. Foster translated. He wanted to preserve them, to feel their vibrations forever. He thought he was honoring them. Sarah's heart ached as she listened. Simon wasn't just a cold-blooded killer. He was a deeply disturbed man who had lost his way. She knew they had to stop him, but she also felt a pang of sympathy for the silent world he inhabited. "Ask him why he took their vocal cords," Sarah said softly. Dr. Foster signed the question to Simon, who stared at her for a long moment before answering. "He says he wanted to keep a part of them with him, to feel their presence even in the silence." The resolution Simon Jacobs was found guilty of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison. As the trial ended, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of his twisted mind. She wondered how many more people like him were out there, hiding in the shadows of their own obsessions. The city gradually returned to its usual rhythm, but the memory of the silent surgeon lingered. Sarah and Jake continued their work, knowing that there would always be another case, another mystery to solve. But they also carried with them the knowledge that sometimes the most profound darkness came from the places of silence and isolation. Epilogue. Sarah stood on the rooftop of her apartment building, looking out over the city. The sounds of New York filled the air, a constant reminder of the life and energy that flowed through its streets. She thought about Simon and the world he lived in, a world without sound. She couldn't imagine the silence, the loneliness that must have consumed him as the sun set. She made a silent vow to continue her work, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, and to seek justice for those whose voices had been silenced forever. The sound of silence would never be forgotten, but she would ensure that it wouldn't claim any more lives.